the digital world and advocating for safer online spaces for children with policymakers. She has previous experience at Sky and Vodafone, and she brings invaluable expertise in engaging parents, industry, and government on critical digital safety issues, and has been awarded an MBE for dedication to children's online safety and contributions to the field. And then we have Professor Victoria Goodyear. Victoria is Professor of Physical Activity, Health and Wellbeing in the School of Sport, Exercises and Rehabilitation Sciences and the Institute of Mental Health at the University of Birmingham. She is a leading expert on social media, digital technologies, and children and young people's health and wellbeing, learning and pedagogy in online environments, amongst other topics. Recent research includes a paper on how approaches to children's smartphone and social media use must go beyond bans, and a cross-sectional observational study looking at school phone policies and their association with mental well-being, phone use, and social media use. So rather than me introduce the topic, I am by no means an expert. I thought I would start here, and I'd love to hear first, Victoria, from you a bit about the research, particularly some of the recent research you've been doing, which is focused on smartphone bans in the school environment, and I thought that would be a good place for us to start.
Yep, so thank you, and it's lovely to be here, and thank you for the invitation to talk today. At the University of Birmingham, we led the first worldwide study on the impact of school phone policies on adolescents' health and well-being. So it was a national study. Data was collected from over 1,200 pupils across 30 different schools across England. And what we did in that study was really interested to compare the outcomes between adolescents who attended a school that had a restrictive phone policy, also known as a phone ban, versus a permissive policy, so those where phones are allowed to be used during the school day. Now, what we found was that there was no difference in outcomes for adolescents who attended a school with a phone ban versus no phone ban. And those outcomes were mental health, so that was mental well-being, anxiety and depression, physical activity and sleep, disruptive classroom behaviour, and attainment in English and maths, and levels of problematic phone use. Now, that might be a surprise. We would perhaps expect that phone policies to have that difference. So if we go further into the detail about what we found, we did find that the school phone policies, so the restrictive school phone policies, lowered in-school phone use and social media use. So they lowered in-school phone use by 40 minutes and social media by 30 minutes. But when we looked at weekday and week and weekend use overall, there was no difference. So it did lower in-school use, so between 9 to 3, lower. Now, when the second key finding from that study was that the more time you spend on your phones and social media, the worse outcomes in all of those areas. So if you spend more time on your phone, you're going to have worse mental health, you're going to have worse physical activity and sleep, worse attainment and worse behaviour. And perhaps some of us could link with that. You know, if we spend more time on our phones, we tend to go to sleep a bit later. Now, the median time that they spent on their phones was 4 to 6 hours per day, and on social media, 2 to 4 hours. So if we put that into the bigger picture and we think, okay, so the school phone policies are reducing it by 40 minutes and 30 minutes, then it's just simply not enough to tackle those negative impacts. So this study tells us that screen time, is an important issue that we need to focus on. It's not the only issue, but it is an important issue. But we need to do more than ban phones alone, and we need to be thinking about inside and outside of school phone use.
I think, it's a really fascinating piece of research, and I really recommend, if you're interested, that you go and read it. And I think it really opens up this idea that what we're facing here is not one simple question, not one simple answer, but a number of complicated and big questions with quite large, solutions that we need to think that are about interconnected systems and processes and ways of behaving and working together. Josie, I'd love to go to you now and hear a bit about how you are thinking about this topic through the work that you're doing.
Thank you. We work with Internet Matters very, very closely. And what we do is we embed advice for parents across all of our customer touchpoints in order to help parents sort of make a choice about how they want to help their children get digital and or not, depending on what they want to choose. And previously we worked with the NSPCC in a similar way as well. We also put parental controls across all of our servers. So sorry, we're Virgin Media and we're O2, so that's mobile and at home. And we're providing the connectivity for people into their homes. Parents can really kind of even break it down into like what devices have access to what content. And we do a lot of age verification and blocking. We also come at this issue from the perspective of online safety, not just being about what content you see, but also how you can be treated when you're online, and really thinking about vulnerable consumers. And so we also do a lot on scam and fraud prevention, which is for all of our customers, completely free service embedded. And we launched an AI granny last year. I don't know if anyone saw her, Daisy. And Daisy is our head of scammer relations, I think is her name, and she spends about 45 minutes talking to scammers on the phone so that our customers don't have to. So we really come at this from a perspective of young people and their sort of introduction to the online world via their parents, and then also scam and fraud prevention for everyone. But I think where we're going is that is not enough, and that what we need to be focused on is the quite harmful digital culture that all of us have got into. We're very addicted, and that's not on us. It's not our fault. It's by design. And there's lots more we need to be doing. So I'll come on to that a bit later.
And I think that really nicely brings us to you, Caroline, and the work you do at Internet Matters. So yeah, we'd love to hear a bit about some of the support and the research that you're doing and how that sort of feeds into this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, kids are growing up today in an inescapably digital world, you know, whether it's the ed tech they use at school or, you know, messaging their friends or whatever, you know, to stay connected, to do learning and everything else. It is just inescapably digital. And they have a really complex relationship with technology as well, in that, you know, most of the time it can be fine, but you can go from an app being 1 minute being really happy and the next minute being really sad, dependent on either what you've seen or how people have reacted or whatever. So it's a real challenging environment for both kids and parents to manage. We've been doing a piece of research every year called our Digital Wellbeing Index. So we're just about to do our 5th year of it, which is a study that looks at the impact of connected technology on children's wellbeing. And it looks across the physical dimensions, so whether they're out and about, but also some social, emotional, and then developmental in terms of sort of cognitive and academic ability. And I think that study, what that overwhelmingly shows is that the positives outweigh the negatives. And that's something, and that's from both parents and from young people themselves. But what it does also say is that online harm remains stubbornly high, and it's about 2/3 of children that basically say they've experienced some form of online harm. You know, and we've seen over the last few years, we've seen the shape of that slightly change. So, you know, when I started this role, it was very much about seeing pornography and about being cyberbullied, and now it's about misogyny, it's about online hate. It's about AI fueling the rise of mis and disinformation and fake news. So I think, you know, it's not surprising that families feel overwhelmed by the whole issue. They really do need help, and that's why a lot of our work is focused around media literacy. And when we talk about media literacy, that's the skills that kind of, you know, children need to navigate this environment they find themselves in. So, you know, basically being able to evaluate the information they see and distinguish what's true, what's false, to create and share responsibly, and also to protect themselves from the risks that they see. So ultimately, you know, they're going to face risks. What we need to do is give them strategies so that those risks don't become harmful. So I think it's really challenging for parents. Is there more that could be done by all of the different players in this space? Very much so.
And I think, yeah, in all of the conversations we've sort of had before today, I think one thing that came across strongly was that this isn't about one age group. It's not about one demographic. We have to think about this in the whole and really understand, particularly as well, where the vulnerable users are and how we can, you know, tailor those services and the protections out there to ensure that they're working for everyone. I would love to spend a bit of time digging into the topic of smartphone bans a bit more, because I think that is something that is bandied around quite a lot as a bit of a potential silver bullet solution here. And I think we are seeing increasing noise around the topic at the moment, with groups emerging such as Wait Until 8th in the US, which is a kind of collective agreement to sort of not give your children smartphones until the 8th grade, and other groups as well, like Smartphone Free Childhood, the Parent Pact, and Rage Against the Screen in the UK. Carolyn, at Internet Matters, you've conducted quite extensive research into kind of the banning smartphones, including the views of parents in particular. For example, 74% of parents recognise that enforcing a ban on smartphones for under 14s would be difficult because creative children can circumnavigate rules, and you cannot force a ban across households. I mean, that's one element of what you've looked at, but yeah, I'd love to expand on that a bit more.
We've done 2 studies. We've done both a study with parents and then a study we followed up with doing a study with children themselves. Parents felt more strongly about banning social media than they did about banning smartphones per se, which is kind of understandable. But, you know, and less than a third of parents said that they felt the benefits of social media outweighed the risks. So parents are not oblivious to the risks of social media. What we saw in the research was it's the parents of younger children that feel more strongly. So it's the age where, you know, they're coming into the latter end of primary school, thinking about giving them a phone, or the younger end of secondary, where there's this enormous pressure that suddenly you have to have the phone and be on every app. And we're seeing that's the sort of sweet spot where parents are basically saying, I'm much more supportive of the ban. But ultimately what they said is they want it to be their choice. You know, it was only actually sort of, you know, 40%, 30-something% that said they were supportive of a ban, but 70% said they should be the ones that have the choice of whether their kids should be on social media. Kids, as sort of somewhat unsurprisingly, said they didn't want a ban. But what we did see was we saw older teens saying they'd like to see more age restrictions in place for younger kids. You know, there was definitely a view that some social media apps like X should have a higher age rating than it currently does. They also, as you mentioned, said that they thought a ban would be effective. It wouldn't be effective because all kids think they can get around everything. So I think, you know, it's a really interesting topic that will rumble on all the time, that we don't have effective regulation and effective sort of safety by design from the technology companies. The only thing I would say is just that when it comes to actually banning, we think it's a bit of a blunt approach. You know, the right answer is for children to have digital spaces that they feel safe in and that are age appropriate. And I think there's, whilst banning sort of seems like a really obvious thing to do, I think there's unintended consequences of that, which are the tech companies won't have to sort their platforms out to remove all of this legal but harmful content for kids. It might drive kids to riskier spaces online. You know, it takes a matter of days for something new to happen and for it to have 5 million people online. You know, and so I think there's a challenge that we might just take people off, you know, the familiar platforms that are being regulated to much more risky spaces. And I think it would be difficult to enforce. You'd have to have really effective age verification. So, you know, we've seen the dialogue about having a digital ID recently, you know, but it would mean that every child would have to be age verified in order to do this. So I think, you know, there's a time window, I think, that we have to get this right. And if we don't, I think that demand for bans will continue to grow. But I think what we should focus on is getting it right for young people.
I see you nodding quite a lot, Victoria, because this is obviously something you've looked at in quite a lot of detail. So, yeah, would love to sort of hear how that resonates with the findings of your research.
Yeah, and I agree with everything that's been said. But, I mean, coming from a research perspective, as we said, the phone bans are not the silver bullet. And when we look at other comparable approaches, they've been useful for issues like smoking. We can see a change in direction. But with the phones and the social media, one of the challenges is that we don't have, there's not a clear-cut relationship. So there are associations that I mentioned earlier there's a link between the more time you spend on your phone and worse outcomes. That's an association. There's no cause and effect. So one way to look at that is to say, well, you know, we're observing some of the issues and we do need to act, and we completely agree on that. The other way to think of that is, what are the unintended consequences of bans, and what are the risks of imposing a bans? And if we think about in a digital society where we all are, we have phones and they're used for almost everything, to ordering food, you know, to travel and all those sorts of things throughout a day. We need those devices. Banning it could be a problem in those issues, and it's quite difficult to impose. And then some of the other unintended consequences that we might consider is that some people, if they have a mental health vulnerability, then they could be exposed to more harms if they see content on social media. The other way to think of it is, some people with a mental health vulnerability feel particularly isolated, and they will find communities and refuge and support, and it acts as a form of healthcare and awareness when they can't access some of the services that are currently overwhelmed at the moment. So if we suddenly blocked a phone for those people where they've been accessing that support service, that could be a risk. Another aspect could be some adolescents with certain needs. So we heard about EdTech, you know, so there's some neurodivergent young people and phones and people with various other needs and issues. It could have negative consequences if we ban phones in that sense. And then also, you know, there's certain cultures where access to information online is important because they cannot have that open discussion in certain cultures. So it can, for different people at different times in their lives and in different places and in different environments and different cultures, there could be unintended consequences. So a blanket ban is as much as a risk as it could be seen as a benefit. And so I think what we need to do is just move the debates beyond a sole focus on bans and think, what else could we do in that space? How could we better support young people to thrive in a digital society? And some of the things that we've been working through in our research groups is the idea of age-appropriate design of phones and social media. Now, there are debates about that as well, but how could we design phones with what young people's well-being in mind? And then the other aspect is education. So you probably had the term digital literacy, media literacy, now algorithmic literacy. I think whatever it is, there needs to be a better form of education that's not just in school, that's around the different spaces that we learn formally and informally. And that education needs to be for young people, for parents, for teachers, for schools, and then also the people that are making decisions in these spaces. So we can have we can evaluate decisions and make decisions based on critical thinking skills and evidence at the same time.
It's just an interesting thought. Professor Sonia Livingston does a fantastic analogy about food, yeah? So not all food is good for us, in the same way that not all social media is good for us, but we don't ban food. We put health warnings on it, we have education programs, we tax it. You know, we do a number of different things that help the society understand that some food is bad for you. And that I think taking a sort of similar approach with social media is something we need to think about.
Yeah. I think it also feeds into a conversation we were having this morning in the forum stories when we were talking about AI and sort of how companies are sort of implementing it in their work, in the creative process, and how they're trying to sort of manage that in a way that they're approaching it, you know, thinking about AI ethics and the governance around AI. And the topic of kind of regulation came up, and how regulation is going to struggle to keep up when every week almost it feels like we have a new technology, a new app, a new corner of the dark web that children are able to access, and sort of how can regulation keep up with that. So, you know, we had the introduction of the online safety bill, and potentially we're starting to see some longer term thinking about the impacts in this area. So I'd love to spend a bit of time just maybe talking about kind of the regulation side of it, some of the tools and services that are out there that are providing support to individuals and family, and then maybe a bit on the sort of direction you potentially would like to see this taking in the future. So Carolyn, I might go to you first on this one.
I mean, the Online Safety Act's been a long time coming and is long overdue, but they have a massive job on their hands. I think it's really important that we have regulated services and that Ofcom a given time to kind of see if they can enforce the regulation in the way that it's intended. I think it should be good for children. It should tackle all illegal harms, but it should also tackle what we call legal but harmful, so things like dangerous challenges or children seeing pornography. They're legal content, but at the end of the day, kids shouldn't be seeing that stuff. But it's a bit early to sort of judge if it's going well. I mean, we're told they're making great progress on putting AV, age verification, on pornography websites. That's good to see, and I think they're now up to 3 different cases that they've raised against various companies that don't have age verification in place. But, it'll be interesting to see. It relies on tech companies doing what's called transparency reports. So they sort of submit their own marking of their homework into Ofcom, and then Ofcom decide whether they've been good or not. So we'll see. I think that on the plus side, though, just the simple effect of having that regulation has meant we've seen lots of different tools and features, mentioned safety by design, being introduced into platforms, which can only be a good thing. I think there's just a lack of transparency about whether any of those actually work, because they're run by the companies, and unless they share that information about how effective they are. So again, not a silver bullet, but something that's well overdue, and we'd certainly like to see Ofcom be given a chance to see if they can enforce it strictly.
Josie, given you spend a lot of time thinking about sort of age-appropriate tools and services and how to support, people using this technology every day, I guess how are you seeing your customers interact with the tools and services that you offer, and how you're kind of managing that with them?
Yeah, I think, to be totally honest, not many people use our parental controls. I think and it's quite across the board. I think with many telecoms providers, but obviously don't know how many people buy their phones. I don't know if they're definitely buying it for their children. It could be that not many children have phones, which I think is not the case. But and obviously it's based on choice for them. I think that whole kind of, they are just a tool in a big toolbox of things that need to happen. I think to your point around media literacy is like the critical piece that we need. Media, digital, algorithmic literacy, AI literacy, we need to be calling for that and having a kind of cross-government mission or strategy that's actually held, because there's like pockets across government on media literacy at the moment with Ofcom. There should be a decision on the Department for Education whether it'll be embedded within the curriculum, which it currently isn't. That should be the case, and then it's about how teachers are supported in order to deliver media literacy. That is, I think, where we really need to focus, and I think what we can do as a telecoms company and a tech company can ensure that we are embedding advice and nudges and sort of helping people critically engage as much as possible with their online experience. In the UK, the reading age, this is another part of it, before we even get to media or digital literacy, the reading age in the UK is on average between 9 and 11 years old. That is really, really low. And critical thinking is also declining. So there's a much bigger issue of the fact that before we even get to being online, we aren't critically engaging with what we're seeing. And that obviously plays out in the misinformation. It plays out in the kind of polarization that we're seeing. So I think that sort of education piece, in formal and informal settings, like you mentioned, Vicky, I think is where we really, really need to be focusing, as well as the way that tech is also designed. I think there's also that informal education piece needs to come from all of us as adults as well. We are all passively engaging. Most of us passively engage with the online world, and that sets a kind of culture which is quite harmful that we all sort of, everyone leans into. A lot of the focus is on parents and what parents need to do for their children, or what they need to buy for their children. But then even just sort of the way that we all act as adults needs to sort of mirror what we want young people to do as well. And us being up to date on how the internet works and how we're going to engage with it in terms of the algorithms, how we're going to set up our algorithms, how we're going to spring clean our feeds, how we're going to tackle misinformation, how we're going to tackle that in our conversations, will also have an impact on how young people are learning too. So I think that informal education is critical.
I think even how much we use our phones, I mean, it's quite hard to implement a ban at home if you're then on your own phone all the time.
Yeah.
Victor, I'll just sort of, a question sort of about how you are working in sort of that space between research and regulation and public policy, and how you're seeing that come through.
I mean, we're more on the evidence kind of side rather than the regulation, so we provide advice in that sense. I'd say, we need to, if I'm saying we need to do more than bans, then we need to have a more age-appropriate design, more regulation, and there are examples of good practice, and we need to sort of developing tools and things to support young people, schools, and teachers and parents. So, yeah.
I think, one question that sort of emerged as we've been talking is we've been talking a lot about sort of age-appropriate design and some of the fact that it's so fast-moving, and I guess what kind of emerging technologies, thinking about things like AR and VR and AI companions, do you see as potentially posing some of the kind of biggest challenges to sort of digital well-being or safety online in the next maybe 5 to 10 years? Obviously, there will be technology in 10 years that we haven't even thought of yet, but just sort of where you see it going.
I think there's a lot to get worried about in terms of AI. There's a lot to be very positive about AI as well, of course, but I think when it comes to children, I think there is a few things that we need to think about. We've done a couple of pieces, and we've got another one that's just about to come out, but the first two, one was about AI chatbots, so these are like My AI on Snapchat or ChatGPT even, where you just talk to a chatbot. And we saw a couple of really concerning things about those. The first is children's belief that they're talking, it's easier to talk to a chatbot than it is to talk to a real person. So we had 35% said talking to a chatbot was like talking to a friend. So, the chatbots are configured to talk to you like they are a friend. And I think for young people, that's if you're lonely, isolated, got problems, you start talking to this computer and start believing that it's your friend. And vulnerable kids, even worse, we saw a quarter of them saying that they preferred talking to a chatbot than to talking to a real person. So I think there's that emotional dependency on AI that we don't know anything about. I think the other issue is just about accuracy. I think it's well documented that the right answer for AI is to give you an answer, not necessarily the most accurate answer. So again, we saw 4 in 10 kids saying, got no problem believing what's on AI at all whatsoever. But that's so vitally important when you think we've got an elections bill coming up that's going to give 16-year-olds the vote. We need to make sure that young people are being provided with factually correct information. So I think that part of AI is not so great. We also see AI being used to manipulate imagery. So we did a report about new deep fakes. That's all very depressing, because young people are now concerned that it's not so much I'm going to create an image of myself and take the risk of sharing it with somebody. It's that someone can do that to me without me having done anything. I can have an image created of me and then I can have it shared around, and I'm totally out of control of that situation. And so they really fear for that. They think that's potentially worse than having done it themselves. And then the report we're about to launch will be looking at the impact of news, fake news and mis and disinformation. So I think AI in itself, lots of huge positives, but I think getting our head around what that means for potential risks to children online and how regulation is going to deal with that, I think is a really big challenge.
And I guess sort of leading on from that just a bit then, so I guess in terms, we talked about quite a few different tools and features that are available. I don't know if you kind of are seeing any of them work slightly better than others, like things like screen time limits. I guess we've talked about critical thinking being a big gap in sort of how tools and services are used in terms of how effective they then can be. But I don't know if there's sort of any particular tools or features you're seeing land better than others or more effective.
Go, or shall I go? There's a few I think I would mention. Apple's screen time's pretty good. Google Family Link, they're kind of good baseline products. I know the uptake on parental controls isn't good, but when it's used, when kids don't know how to use a VPN, they work very effectively. So I think there's a few. I think it's just really hard because, as I say, we don't have that assessment of whether the tools are actually making a difference. But coming back to Josie's point, I think, tools are great and they are helpful in your armoury as a parent in terms of sort of mitigating risk. But really, it's about staying engaged as a parent and being actively involved and trying to help your children understand that they are going to come across stuff online and agreeing what they should do. You know, most of the time, when something bad happens, they go to parents to get it sorted out and for that help. So it's really important that parents get themselves across this kind of stuff.
There's some interesting tech that's coming out. I think it's in the Netherlands. It's called Tap Out, and it's this brilliant device. This is more kind of aimed at adults, but you can you have to physically tap your phone onto a little device that you leave at home, and that would lock down certain features and just turn your phone into a feature phone if you want, and you can't actually get it back to how it was until you tap it back onto this physical device, because the only thing with on phone settings is that you can just easily turn them off or click ignore. So for anybody that needs to take those steps of like transitioning into like a digital minimalist kind of approach, you can start doing it by cutting everything out for certain blocks of time in a physical way where you just cannot get it back on your phone. And then you start to learn what actually nourishes you and what actually serves a purpose for what you want to do when you're online. Because what we tend to do, well, I'm talking from experience, but what I tend to do is just kind of float around between apps, trying to sort of find something to take up my brain time or something like that. And that passive and not active engagement is what can be quite harmful. So this helps you sort of work out what serves you and what doesn't serve you. So that's quite a good piece. And then I've also heard quite a bit about, I think there's a company in America that started it, but it's like going back to having a landline for young people. So for people sort of, if we're saying smartphones is more sort of like older teens and then before that, but children still want to be able to connect to each other. I don't know if anyone remembers sort of when you were younger, you were allowed 59 minutes of free phone calls on the landline and then you had to hang up and then call back again. But bringing that back, and obviously everything's transitioning, or not obviously, but everything is transitioning from in the digital switchover, so they'll have to be digital. So it's sort of thinking about these sort of, it's almost like a landline, but it goes through the internet, and you can do nothing else on it, which is I thought was really interesting. And apparently that's quite popular. So that's another solution for keeping kids connected. But again, to my point, they have to be mixed with critical thinking, higher literacy understanding, and everything else around it, and honest conversations between parents and kids, and adult to adult too.
I am definitely guilty of ignoring my own time limits, so they are really easy to just swipe off.
Yeah.
Just before we move to the floor, Victoria, I don't know if there's anything you want to add at the end there.
Yeah, I think we often looked at evidence for solutions, and I think one of the challenges is at the minute that we don't have the evidence available to inform the decisions, and even if that evidence that is available, it's not necessarily robust as for other health and mental health issues and beyond that. I think we need to think a bit differently. So without criticising my own profession, universities are typically very slow to do the research. So I talked about cause and effect evidence. You know, those sorts of studies from idea through to publication takes around 5 years. So the study that I mentioned at this very start on school phone bans, we started getting insight from schools and from young people that phone bans were taking place in 2019, and it's 2025 when that paper was published. So we have had COVID in the middle of that. It disrupted things, but you know, that's the sort of timescales that you're looking at. And you know, if you think about in 2019, TikTok wasn't really an issue then, and so the pace of change and AI wasn't really, and the pace of change has really shifted. And so now when another example with that study is that when we started that study, it was 60% of schools had a phone ban in place. At the point when we started going out to schools to find out what was going on, 90% of schools. So it really shifted, and the research was so far behind. So I think we need to do a better way of doing research, but we need to be doing things so we're not reacting, we're ahead of it and informing, so we can promote the benefits and minimise the harms as much as possible. So I think we need to rethink in a digital age, and this is a big aim, but I don't know how to achieve that, is how we do research to improve things.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the last sort of bit of time we've got now, I'd love to open it up to the floor. Just wanted to see, now I've got the sun in my eyes, but are there any questions out there? Yes, Mark at the front.
Good afternoon. It was a fascinating debate, and my question would be what traditional media can do to help to ease the situation?
I think, what can traditional media do? I think there's a huge job to raise awareness, basically. I go back to the point that I think parents are feeling a bit overwhelmed by the whole situation. They're not quite sure what they should be doing. We don't have clear rules, and to a certain extent, it's left to parents and children to navigate the situation themselves, So I think where traditional media could really support is if we could agree a collective set of principles around young people's use of phones and social media, which might be things like really you can't be on social media until you're 13, and really you shouldn't have a smartphone if you're at primary school, sensible things like that. Traditional media could get that message out because that's what parents want. They want the kind of sensible guidance that you can all fall back on, like 5 fruit and veg a day, and the sugar swaps, those kinds of, not go back to the obesity argument, but if we can land those messages with families, I think that would be a huge step forward.
I've seen the Guardian's been doing a whole thing on you don't need your smartphone and giving lots of guidance around that, which I found really nice. I don't know if it's just actually my algorithms that's just shoving me all of this now, that and cats. But I am getting a lot of the content. So I think there's, trying the more that alternative ways of approaching or changing our digital culture is sort of shown to us that isn't just screen time settings. It's helping us to really think about why we're using tech, how we can engage in it. Is going to help us expand our minds, and the more of us that think about it in a different way will hopefully shift culture slightly. So I think traditional media is essential for getting that research out, getting that information out there. But then again, haven't got a flow of research coming out that quickly, have we?
Well, I think we can learn some stuff from what we know about traditional media. So in the 1940s, there was talk about the radio, and it was going to cause mental health harms. And then we're on now from that, and it's not necessarily as clear cut as it was worried about. We've also had the analogies of the TV and the couch potato, and if we go back and what was those messages, and I'm coming from my physical activity background now, is that we need to think about it as in a lifestyle. So when you think about physical activity, the guidelines aren't to do physical activity all day, it's about your lifestyle. So how does it fit in? So you need to eat, you need to communicate with other people, you need to education, you need to learn from things, and screens are part of that as an important component. So perhaps we need to go back, and we already know a lot from TV and radio already.
Simon.
Hello, can any of the panel say a bit about, so I'm thinking about your obesity analogy, and I'm thinking a bit about the addictiveness of the mobile phone. And that addictiveness doesn't come around by accident. There's smart people trying to make me pick my phone up and make me move from one app to another and make me stay online. Is there anything in the sort of current state of the art in terms of design, app design, phone design, algorithm design, which would be a route into regulation? Are there better phone design standards that we could use?
So I could come from what we know about addiction in terms of, we often use the term problematic use in kind of research space. And one of the concepts we use is fear of missing out. And in relation to a ban, one of the challenges is if we have a phone, when you're with your phone, it's distracting. So that's your fear of missing out on, you want to look at it if you feel it buzz and you're in school. But if you're without your phone, it's distracting. So the addiction is with or without the presence of a phone. So it's that's when the bans become quite challenging to do. So that's one angle in terms of the prohibited and accepted use in terms of addiction.
I think you're right. I mean, parents are up against the greatest minds in the west coast of America. That it's all about if I make this flag on the app red, then that's really important. You'll open it and go look at it. And I think there has been some work done through the age-appropriate design code to minimise things, certain features like autoplay features and turning off notifications and all of that. So I think you're absolutely right. I think there is more that can be done. And we are starting to see some of that come through, like TikTok have got a bedtime at 10 o'clock, although it's not really bedtime, it just sort of tells you it's a good time to stop. You know, we've got, you can put limits on and all the rest of it. But I think, yes, absolutely, there's more more that could be done to make sure young people weren't quite so captivated by the content that they were viewing, you know, and that's where, you know, Ofcom talk about media literacy by design, and I think that's some of the things that they're looking to try and implement through the new regulation.
Yeah, I think it's the attention economy, isn't it? So the longer we can hold the attention of somebody, the more data we can get, the more we can sell it on. That is the whole model of the internet, and that's why it's free at the moment, and the whole view of us being we're not even customers anymore, we're products ourselves is the kind of where we've got ourselves into. I don't think that the Online Safety Act doesn't address algorithmic reform directly in its current format. I don't think we're going to see change that quickly in that space. So if we can help people understand that how algorithms work and how the content they might be seeing is going to try and hold you for as long as possible, and that's because of the way your algorithm settings are, that might help move people along a little bit, and then just grayscale your phone at the same time, because just the colour will keep you going.
We've probably got time for one more question, or maybe two more.
Hi, so I'm interested in the fact that you raised the attention economy, and particularly that effect of information just flowing at you. People don't really choose their content anymore. Content chooses them, in that sense. Social media companies and media companies have a lot invested in this, right? Like the way that growth has been achieved is by shortening time span, like the time frames that digital ads are presented, for example, or putting more into that environment. And that is having an effect on the way that people are able to process information. Media literacy cannot work if people are overwhelmed with information. What are social media companies or media or digital companies in particular that any of you are aware of? What steps are they taking to minimize that for children, teenagers, and other vulnerable audiences?
It's not a social media company, but I know that Tim Berners-Lee, or Sir Tim Berners-Lee, has just, he's been working out of MIT to create this platform called Solid, which is how all of your data, it's about you having control over how your data is used, almost like a data stewardship model. And I think that could be a really interesting approach, that you kind of, you decide how companies can use your data, and then that informs algorithms as well. So that's quite an interesting piece. I only know about that from this morning when I started reading this new book, though, so that's as much content as I have on it, but that might be an interesting piece to look at.
Yeah, I mean, I do think the OSA will, if it's implemented forcefully and the tech companies fulfill their obligations, we should be at least removing harmful content out the feed, right? And then, as I say, there is this sort of media literacy obligation as part of the OSA. It's not as clear as the kind of hard, you've got to remove these harms and everything, where they are expecting platforms to, as I say, embed media literacy, which is these things like you've been on the platform for an hour, it's time to do something else, you know, or, you know, are you sure this is the content you wanted to see, and put things. So I think the jury's out, but certainly for children, that there's definitely an ambition to create an environment where, you know, the algorithm is less harmful. You know, we're by no means there yet, but in theory it should at least be less harmful.
Yeah, I think an aspiration that we could work towards is for people feeling control of their phones and social media rather than it controlling them, and being aware of the kind of tools and the aspects, and also being aware that, you know, there are time points when you become more vulnerable and it starts to control you. So you know that, you know, we can all probably think of a situation where we might have spent more time on our phones one day or another, you know. So being critically aware of our high and low points, and try and have the tools to feel that you're in control of those environments rather than it continuously controlling what you're doing.
I think that's a really nice place for us to actually finish, and a nice final thought, and one that we can all go away and try and do something about, which is always a nice way to finish. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's been wonderful to chat with you, and I found it interesting and absolutely fascinating. So yeah, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks.